Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. My name is Michael Swerdlow, and I'm the Antimonopoly lead for the Democracy Policy Network. And I'm also the author of our Antimonopoly Toolkit, which we just released about a month or two ago, which covers 14 actionable anti-monopoly reforms that states can take right now, as well as the precedents and experts, some of which, precedents right here in the chat with us. But yeah, anyway, today I'll be your moderator and have the privilege of being in conversation with two anti-monopoly champions here. Solana Rice, who is the co-founder of Liberation in a Generation, a national movement to build power for people of color to transform the economy into a liberation economy within one generation. She's also the co-author of the Anti-Monopoly Activism Guide, Reclaiming Power Through Racial Justice, which we're really excited to engage with today. Our other panelist is New York State Senator Michael Gianaris, who is the Deputy Majority Leader and author of the 21st Century Antitrust Act, which is the first major piece of antitrust legislation to make it through a state house, a single body of state house, in decades. So we are very excited to have both of them here. I'm just going to give a brief description of anti-monopoly, because when people hear about it, a lot of times they think of abstract, far off experts in rooms and courtrooms deciding, what does a company really own and not own and this and that. But at its core, it's a very deeply personal idea. It's a very deeply visceral idea, which is that in more and more of American life, a small number of corporations have the power to make the rules and dominate large sections of the public. For workers, what that means is that they get to keep our wages lower. The Treasury concluded that wages are about 20% lower than they would be for the average worker if concentration wasn't as bad as it was. For consumers, that means that inflation is accelerated by about 25%, according to a Federal Reserve Bank, because they have the ability to raise prices and no one can do anything about it. And for everyone else, it means that we have fewer choices. That if you run a small business and you need to buy or sell to your key market, you might have to buy or sell to a monopolist. You might have nowhere else to go. Anti-monopoly says that this power exists, that it's real, and that we have tools to do something about it. Namely, we can overhaul our antitrust laws. We can make new business regulations, like saying that no employer should get to misclassify an employee as a contractor. We get to use collective bargaining to empower workers and to empower small businesses to bargain with monopolists at even playing fields. And we also get to create public options, publicly run businesses in markets where business is deeply anti-competitive. So anti-monopoly presents this coherent tool. And the question today for this panel is, how do we get it done? What should we get done? And, as we all know, that there's some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that monopolists can use their economic power to convert it to political power and to fight against anything that we want to get done. The good news is we've been here before. 100 plus years ago, we had a very similar situation, and monopolists could use political power then too. But a coalition of small businesses, workers, farmers came together and they demanded reform. And we can do it again. So the even better news, though, is that coalition was started at the state level, and that it was the states that first passed these laws. And after the first state passed the antitrust law in 1888, it only took 2 more years for 13 more states to follow through, as well as the federal government. So that's the background. And now I'm going to just throw to the panel. I think my first overall question is, in doing anti-monopoly work, what have you learned, and what should this group know?
Should I begin, Michael?
Sure.
Okay. Hi. Well, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. And I think this is a fascinating issue, and we're talking about something that is in desperate need of reform and being done. So we have antitrust laws in this country and a lot of the states individually, and nobody questions them and the need for them today. But back 100 years ago, as you pointed out, when they were first enacted, a lot of people did, and a lot of powerful forces did, those who were most affected by them. And we now have a situation 100 years into the future where the economy has changed pretty dramatically. We have a new era of robber barons who are dominating the playing field and squeezing out small and medium-sized businesses, hurting workers. And these laws now that everyone agrees should exist in some form need to be brought up to speed to catch up to what's happening. And so we've done that here in New York. We proposed the 21st Century Antitrust Act that we passed through the Senate a couple of times now. We're trying to make progress in the Assembly as well to get it done. And it would do it does a lot of things, but it would do a couple of really big, important things. One is it would change the very standard by which we tackle these dominant players. So we would move from the monopoly standards that exist today that are inadequate, both because the tactics have changed and also because court decisions have whittled them down to ineffectiveness. And we would move to an abuse of dominance standard that is in place in much of the rest of the world, which gives regulators a stronger hand against some of these players and allows them to tackle the tactics that are being used that are unprecedented. You talk about a situation where, say, a company runs a very popular search engine, but also has interest in the products that pop up as results on that search engine. Obviously, the potential for conflict and for abuse of their dominant position is there for all to see. And right now, regulators have limited ability to go after that sort of thing. And so that is one aspect of it. The other is we're really trying to apply this to protect workers and employees because some of these big companies are the only game in town if you want a job. And the lack of power, lack of leverage in the hands of workers to negotiate a fair compensation for their services is also obvious in that kind of situation. We see it by the day, people getting abused in these warehouses, not being allowed to work. There's some instances where they have ambulances on call outside the warehouse because they know that people are going to get sick while they're working. These are all things that we can change by empowering the employees, prospective employees, to negotiate fairer terms for themselves. And by addressing that monopsony aspect as well, the bill would provide that power. So we're trying to kind of go at this from two fronts. There's a lot of other pieces to it, but those are the two of the big components of the bill. And as you pointed out, Michael, the big boys are coming out now. We kind of caught them by surprise in the Senate. We passed it, and I don't think they were geared up for battle, but now they are, and we're hearing from all the big players. To the credit of many of the small and medium-sized businesses, they have stepped into the void and are fighting the fight, even though it puts them at risk for obvious reasons in dealing with the large companies. And we are engaged in the fight. We need the Assembly to get it done, and then we'll be on our way to changing the world.
Thanks for that, and thank you for your leadership on those issues. And I'm Solana Rice, co-founder, co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation, as Michael mentioned. And the thing that we are taking away at Liberation in a Generation is that corporate power is an economic and racial justice issue. That at the core of all of the big words, monopoly and monopsony and markets and competition, are people. And as much as almost any issue in our economy, when we have inequities, Black communities, Latina communities, Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, Arab communities are on the front lines of those inequities. And it's so important that we remember that these are, that sometimes the abstract things, as you mentioned, Michael, are real things that happen in folks' lives. As the senator mentioned, they constrain our ability to have income and go to the jobs that we want to. They constrain our health at our workplaces. It constrains our ability to be entrepreneurs. And so at the work of Liberation in a Generation is in part to talk about those real inequities and connect the fights that folks are having, especially that workers are having against corporate power, to these structural issues of anti-monopoly, monopsony, antitrust, and in a way that makes those terms more relevant and accessible, while also acknowledging that often the organizers are the ones that are actually building power to continue these fights over and over. And they are the ones also that can support the policies and the legislation that leaders like Senator Gianaris are doing. So that's something that we learned. Economic justice and racial justice is a key part of the anti-monopoly, antitrust fights, and that organizers can be at the center of that conversation.
Yeah, thanks both of you. In this area, what do winning coalitions look like, and how can we build them, and how are we building them?
Well, the forces on the other side are pretty big and powerful. That's the entire point of what we're trying to do is dilute their power, not only over markets, but over politics and over public policy. And so you really need all hands on deck. And what we've seen here in New York, which has been effective, is a coalition of small businesses, labor organizations are playing a huge role, and grassroots advocacy groups are all coming together. And sometimes when you see groups that often aren't on the same page, that gets people's attention. We're so used to being in our typical frames, business on one side, labor on the other, or what have you. But in this case, when you see small businesses, medium-sized businesses, even very well-known businesses, so, we had a public hearing in the state Senate on this issue last year, and one of the more compelling witnesses was Yelp, because they are big advocates of this legislative approach. And it's one of those things where you may like a particular business, you may not, but to see them on the other side of the big players and big tech caught a lot of people's attention. We need to kind of grab people by the shirt collars and make that point. That helps do that. So when you see labor and business, at least some elements of business, come together, that's the kind of coalition I think ultimately that gets us over the finish line.
And I would just add that I think that there are a number of ways that we can think differently about who our allies are. And what we're seeing, at least nationally, is that it's also important to lay out, at least we think for the organizers especially, to lay out the importance of centering people of color and the folks that are directly impacted, right? And that our goal, our North Star, whomever is at the table, our goal and North Star is to make this a more equitable, fair economy for people of color. And what we're seeing is that sometimes there are concessions made in the politics that lose that North Star, and that we can make incremental changes, and they are good changes. They could be good changes. But if they're not actually serving Black and brown folks, or if we have allied with folks that are also pushing for legislation or policies that actually exclude others, we might be advancing one issue to the detriment of inclusion in another area. So I say all that not to say like we shouldn't partner with unlikely allies, but we should be very clear about the values that are driving the coalition and the allyship, and what we might be sacrificing on the other side to make advances.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, and it's ultimately up to those of us who put the words on the paper in the bill to keep that North Star, right? So what I was trying to suggest is we certainly need help to break through and get this done, because I got to tell you, the mountain of opposition is significant, and if we just stay in our typical corners with the allies we typically have, we're just not going to get there. I mean, that's what we're experiencing here in New York. So I think you're absolutely right, Solana. We need to maintain the core of what we're doing and why we're doing it, but we need help to get there ultimately, and that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, and I would hope that all the worker wins that are happening in New York, for example, are actually hopefully like that somebody's making and connecting those dots between the work that you're doing and advancing and those worker wins. Like those are direct ways to shore up. What you're proposing is also a direct way to shore up and reinforce the wins that workers are having in their workplaces.
And I don't think we've given enough credit in this conversation, because we haven't brought it up yet, to the groups that represent those workers that have been engaged in this fight here in New York. We have a group called Align New York. They've put together a coalition that is making those links, is looking at the worker victories we've had through the strength and courage of a lot of these workers throughout the state, and trying to make the connection to what is in some respects a very academic issue of antitrust, and what does it mean, and how do you tackle it, and really drawing a connection that lets people understand what effect it has on their real lives.
Yeah, should we be looking at organizations like Align or things like it and thinking about how other states can, get something like that going, or does the model look different in different places? Or, yeah.
I don't know, Solana, do you want to go first on that? I can give you my thoughts on it.
I feel like no matter the place, engaging the people who are building power that can reinforce. This is almost like a reinforcing loop, right? That the senator is talking about. Like the folks that are building power need to also help advance the policies, and the policies also need to be attuned to what the organizers and the folks that are building power are seeing on the ground, right? So it's ideally a coalition that works in concert like that. And I think that's wherever we are in the US. Fortunately, while the policies and the state policies might be different, the monopolists tend to look pretty similar, actually, and use very similar tactics and language and strategies. So that's one advantage, I guess, of creating a fight against this. But I do think fundamentally having those coalitions that have that virtuous cycle is important no matter where you're working.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And we're ultimately talking about a battle that is the people against the powerful corporations. So if you don't have someone or many someones organizing the people, you're going to get rolled over. And so we have a great network of organizations like that here in New York, and they have been invaluable in getting us this far. And I would definitely suggest that other states looking to go down this road engage the regular folks.
Yeah. Could we talk a little more concretely about what state anti-monopoly reform means for workers? And about this, you brought up like engaging with labor groups, engaging with the ongoing moment we're having right now around organizing and labor in this country. So I think it'd be great to talk a little more about like what does anti-monopoly deliver for workers, and how do we engage?
And we should also mention part of that coalition here is the Teamsters, who are very engaged on behalf of working people, as well as a host of others that are in the fight. And so what does it mean? Well, what we're doing here in New York is we're proposing what I referenced at the outset, which is a protection against monopsony, which is a dominance over the employee relationship. And when you have a circumstance when an employee or prospective employee doesn't have any cards to play in negotiating for themselves, then they're going to get abused. And that's happening. It's happening every day across America. And so what we're trying to do is create a cause of action for regulators, or even for individuals who've been harmed, to take action when an employer is abusing their dominant position to the detriment of employees. And so what it would mean a whole new area of jurisprudence where typically now you have regulators, even with our weak monopoly laws, you have regulators trying to go in and take action against the big companies for being in a monopolistic position in the market. You would now have the opportunity for employees or regulators on behalf of employees to step in and try and beat back that kind of power that ends up leading to abuse of the workforce.
I will double click on everything the senator says. And I
But
also, I guess, we think a lot at LibGen. We think a lot about We think a lot about national policy, right? And so, I just think it's so important that we keep talking about these state wins, though, because it paves a path for federal work, as Michael, you mentioned at the beginning, but it's not automatic. It's not like, oh, we've got 20 states and now we just do the thing. Like, I think there has to be some mechanism, and maybe it's you all at Democracy Policy Network that are like talking about how these wins add up and what we're learning across states and what it means for federal regulation and policy and coalition building. I don't know, Senator, if you're seeing, like, are you getting excited about the potential of weighing in federally, or seeing
we certainly are. That's the ultimate solution, right? That would obviate the need for us to do anything locally in 50 different states. But it's the history of this country that states take the boldest and first actions that then lead to, we're supposed to be the laboratories for the whole nation. And so especially states that have a big disproportionate impact on the economy, New York, California, and so on, when our states, not to the detriment of any of the smaller states, there's a place for everyone here, but when our states take an action, it almost becomes a national action, because the market can't function without, if New York or California or Illinois, Texas, pick a state that has that big an impact, if they take a regulatory position, it's going to affect the whole market, because you can't separate your behavior as a company in places where the impact is so large. You see it most notably with California emission standards, right? The California emission standards become de facto the national emission standards. In this case, we have the opportunity to do that at an antitrust level.
Solana, in your March 21 anti-monopoly activism guide, you very presciently wrote that skyrocketing prices for life-saving medicines, increasing costs of food, utility bills, and more, due to scant competition created by corporate monopoly, make consumers pay exorbitantly high prices for poor quality products and services. In short, monopoly power constrains our freedom of choice. Choice is often used as a straw man to protect, the powerful. But how can we think about choice in anti-monopoly? And more directly, how can we channel consumers' anger with rising prices and the harms that causes into concrete political action?
Yeah, well, we don't do anything without talking about organizers, right? And organizers are the ones that are having the conversations in living rooms, on doors, every day, day in and day out, about this topic, right? And so it's absolutely critical that the organizers are funded in a long-term way to continue those conversations, because while consumers may feel the pressure on their wallets, they may even make the connection to the fact that corporations are deciding the prices, that they're basically doing price gouging. They might actually folks are probably making that connection. They might not then be able to say, like, but what am I going to do about it besides going to vote? And I think we have to have more outlets. And I think this is, again, where organizers come in. We have to have more responses than, well, you got to go vote. Because I think there are also policies that are, no matter who is in office, that we have to keep our eye on. We have to keep our eye on who is in office, of course. And in the short term, we have to be able to build coalitions that actually have power to influence those who are in office right now. I think that it's so important to understand that folks are experiencing this day in and day out. But it's incumbent upon us as advocates and organizers to uncover the layers of systems and decisions that are being made that impact their everyday. So yes, voting is just one aspect, as folks in the chat are saying. And I think I think what's so interesting right now is that folks feel really disempowered. And I think that's why we, in the report, we don't actually talk, we have a section that talks about consumers. But I think it's time to stop talking about people as consumers. Like, we contribute, so every one of us contributes so much more than just what we can buy, right? We are producers, we are workers, we are teachers, we are caregivers. All the aspects, we are entrepreneurs, like all of these aspects of us are impacted by corporate power and by corporate capture. And so I also think that is another way to connect the fights that organizers are having on everyday issues to corporate power. Because no matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about policing in communities and Black and Brown communities, whether we're talking about surveillance, whether we're talking about creating job opportunities, whether we're talking about housing, you can trace a line back to corporate power and unchecked corporate power, right? And democracy, just our ability to even go vote is impacted by that. So I think it's incumbent upon us to think about folks as whole folks that contribute to the economy in a multitude of ways besides as consumers, and trace that line back to corporate power. And then actually talk about the ways that folks can contribute locally as leaders through our democratic processes, right? It's not the only, and I think that the work that the senator is doing and state policy is a great demonstration that we have many levels of democracy for people to participate in, and we don't have to wait until the feds decide to do something or not to do something. We actually have practices, and I think what's so interesting about what's happening right now is that it's also a gateway into different practices of democracy. So we talk about unions, for example. That is a practice in democracy. That is a practice in governance, which I think is so critical to think about, like, what is the next phase? If we had some wins and somebody mentioned, like, what is our regulatory infrastructure? Well, who is deciding in those regulations, right? Who really has power in decision-making in our regulations? And if we're saying that we're centering the people most impacted, we have to prepare people that are the most impacted to actually be making decisions and doing governance.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I'll say this as someone who's in my line of work: beware of the politician who tells you the answer to your problems is vote for them, because we're seeing right now playing out in real time. And like, I think the Democratic Party is obviously better suited to represent working people and those struggling to make it than the Republican Party, for God's sakes, for sure. But there are plenty of people within my own party who are part of the problem, and you watch it playing out every day on the news, whether it's trying to get a climate proposal done or tackling Roe v. Wade. Every Democrat will tell you go out and vote in November, and you certainly should. You should vote for Democrats. But that is not it if they're not doing what they need to do to address the problems. And what I've found is, yes, certain parties are more inclined one way than another, but really the battle is less Democrat versus Republican, and those who have power and those who do not. And there are plenty of people within my own party who are sitting there shilling for the powerful. And so we got to constantly keep their feet to the fire. Yes, vote for people, and then hold them accountable after your vote is cast. And that requires organizing and staying on top of it and not losing sight of the struggle.
Well, yeah, I think we're coming up on the hour, but I think it's a great place to leave us off. Thank you both for your perspectives, for attending. I saw in the chat, someone said, well, if I have an anti-monopoly problem, my boss is a corporation, what do I do? How do I get involved? I can only speak for our organization, but like, if anyone's interested in doing state level anti-monopoly, organizing, we would love to talk to you. I'm sure others would, and, support the senator's bill. Call, if you're in New York area, call your representative, or wherever you are, call your representative. If you are your representative, think about the ways that you can introduce anti-monopoly legislation and get involved in the work, is what I'd have to say. And if you'd like a shameless plug, feel free to read our anti-monopoly policy guide if you're interested in the specifics of what you can get done. Again, thank you so much, Solana, Senator Gianaris. It's been a pleasure.